On December 9th, 1945, a 2.5-ton military truck attempted to make a left-hand turn in front of Patton's car, but instead crashed into his car, giving the American general traumatic injuries. The American press was prohibited from interacting with the general during his 12-day stay at the military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. Official reports from the U.S. Army and government made it appear that Patton would make a full recovery, or at least be transported back to Boston to be cared for by American nurses and doctors. This is far from the truth. The 4-star general was paralyzed from the neck down after parts of his spine were shifted by the crash and his body was covered in stitches and bandages. The general hardly resembled the swashbuckling persona he gave off. On December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton Jr., who led the first American troops in North Africa and the legendary Third Army across Europe, was pronounced dead. Prior to his death, Patton's military prowess was unequaled, although controversy surrounding his actions nearly led to his dismissal by the United States Congress before the war ended. Overall, Patton's abilities to efficiently lead his armies and strike fear into the Germans undeniably contributed to Allied victory in Europe, and as such, Patton is arguably the greatest general in World War II. He gave the American people hope and inspiration during his triumphant campaigns until his abrupt death struck grief into the American public, which would also solidify his legacy as a legendary military leader. Born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, George Patton was born into a Southern family that had strong military ties in both the U.S. and Confederate Army. From an early age, the young boy was destined for the military and enrolled at the United States Military Academy at West Point. After graduating, Patton looked to develop his career in the military, and on March 9, 1960, the Pontville Raid helped bring the idea to fruition. Patton participated in America's first military action involving motor vehicles, which was the expedition into Mexico to find Villa. When America was pulled into World War I, Patton joined the American Expeditionary Force to Europe and led a group of French tanks on the front lines, becoming one of the first Americans to command tanks. On the infamous day of September 1, 1939, the newly formed Nazi Germany invaded Poland after taking over Austria and Czechoslovakia, which tipped the unstable Europe into a Second World War. 1 years later, on December 7, 1941, bombing Pearl Harbor by a few hundred Japanese bombers would pull the sleeping giant into the war. Officially during the war, America quickly took steps in relieving the British from the bombardment of the German Luftwaffe. Operation Torch was greenlit and preparations began for the amphibious invasion of North Africa in order to get America into Europe. On November 9, 1942, General Patton landed in Casablanca and became one of the leading commanders in North Africa. After the Germans had pushed out of Africa in May of 1943, the remaining commanders prepared an invasion of the island of Sicily with the goal of capturing Messina. Sicily would become the location of one of Patton's first major controversial incidents, where it stopped 2 American soldiers who were recovering in a medical tent due to shell shock and the horrors of the war. This would lead to Congress's first demand for his termination, but instead Eisenhower would force Patton to wait out the D-Day invasion and use Patton's new Third Army to create a version on where the landing would be. Prior to the launch of Operation Overlord, aka D-Day, on April 24, 1944, Patton met with a group of British women and insinuated that after the war, Europe would be led by British and Americans, not the Russians. This unsurprisingly damaged Russo-American relations, which were vital to the succession of the war. It's the second time that Patton was again demanded to be relieved by Congress due to his continued controversy, but Eisenhower defended Patton again. After the success of landing, Patton waits until August 1, 1944, when his army is finally activated in France under his direct command, as well as part of General Bradley's 12th U.S. Army Group. After waiting for the orders to commence his attack, Patton would dash across France until he was stopped at the city of Metz. After taking the city of Metz, Patton's Third Army rested against the original French and German border. While recovering, rumor of a major counteroffensive in the Andes Mountains started to spread across the Allied front, but was dismissed by high-ranking generals. Few believed the Germans could successfully pull off a major counteroffensive. Patton sent a warning to the commander of the Andes force to be cautious and be careful of a German buildup of soldiers, which was ignored. In December of 1944, the 200,000 German soldiers stationed on the Andes Mountains began their push into the Allied army, intending to create a divide to the Western theater. Word of the attack reached Patton, and upon the direction of Eisenhower, Patton would rush to liberate the city of Bastion. Patton's liberation of the surrounded Allied soldiers would signal the tipping point to the Allied front after the conclusion of the Battle of Bulge. Patton continued his relentless push across the Rhine and into Germany. After Russian conquest of Berlin, the German nation surrendered, and the war officially ended on September 2nd, 1945. After the war ended, Patton was placed in charge of the military government of Bavaria in southern Germany. He was quickly relieved from his position because he returned Nazi members to power in local government and was open against denazification. Patton was also openly against the USSR, and when meeting with Soviet generals, was struggling to smile for the camera. While driving down the Autobahn in Germany, a military truck, which was never identified in reports, struck the car Patton was riding in. The general was rushed to a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, and was cared for by the doctors and nurses for 12 days. The reporters tried to gain access to his hospital room to see the state of the general after reports of his declining health was leaked, which contradicted official reports. The general died on December 21st and was later buried in Luxembourg on December 24th. Official reports label the cause of death to be heart failure. The official reports are also highly disputed if this is really how Patton died. When he suspected Patton was assassinated by the USSR government and even his own government decided to silence his hatred for the Russians. The driver of the truck was never reported. None of the witnesses of the crash stepped forward. Passengers of the truck fled the scene of the crash, and no one was ever punished for the crash. He was the only person to be significantly injured in the crash, and the truck had sporadically veered into the opposing lane into the side of the car, where Patton had been sitting. The most crucial evidence towards his assassination would come years after his death, when a former American intelligence operative confessed in October of 1979 to planning and participating in the assassination of General Georges Patton. The cause of death from Patton might be heart failure, but evidence points towards a different and more sinister tale of his tragic death. The man had once said that he wanted to be killed by the last bullet of the last battle of the last war. May have been killed by his own government in order to silence his hatred towards the USSR, who would later become America's greatest enemy. Through Patton's efforts in World War II, he helped establish the modern philosophy in armored warfare for which he had advocated for since the interwar period. His philosophy of in case of doubt, attack, created a war machine that dashed across France until his tanks ran out of fuel. Patton is the father of the modern American doctrine and tactics, as well as the only U.S. general to ever successfully conduct an American blitzkrieg. The philosophy of tanks in war and integration into the pre-existing branches of the military was established during the Second World War with help from Patton, and expanded upon during the following times of peace and war. After his death in 1945, he would later be recognized for his efforts during World War II, which would shine a light onto his legacy. He is credited for his efforts in North Africa and Southern Italy, as well as in Europe, specifically in France and Germany. He struck fear into the hearts of the German High Command, which caused the planned German counteroffensive, called Operation Watch on the Rhine, in German, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, to be deployed away from Patton and through an unprotected area to quickly break out. Finally, the first modern post-World War II tank, designed by America, recognized Patton and was named the M46 Patton in his honor. General Georges Patton assisted in leading the nation's army through the most important war the world had ever seen. While controversial, the American people saw Patton as a figure that the nation could rally behind, and his legendary Third Army inspired to trouble the nation. He was the personification of the American nation during the Second World War, and he left behind a legacy that forged the path for the military that would rise in the aftermath of the Second World War. Patton was a man that did what had to be done, and he was the spirit of the American troops, and while he didn't command the largest force, he commanded the strongest army. Patton was a true American. He once said that it was better to fight for something than live for nothing.